Thanks for stopping by the channel. As always, make sure you're subscribed. Check out the bell icon. Make sure you're going to get notifications from when my videos come up. Today is part 3 of my series on exploring the life of Joseph McCarthy. Well, not so much the life, but the impact of Joseph McCarthy. Today, we're going to talk about what Joseph McCarthy got right. So, did he get anything right? And as I've said in the last 2 videos in this series, he did. Joseph McCarthy absolutely got some things right. And I'm very thankful for how aware he was of what was happening to the United States at that time. Despite the errors, despite the mistakes that he made, despite some of the heavy-handed, constitutionally flawed practices that he invoked, Joseph McCarthy was dead on accurate about something, and that was the Marxist influence that was taking over the United States. This was not something new at the time that McCarthy started his hearings. It was a powerful movement early in the 1900s, and actually at the end of the 1800s, Marxism had begun to, if you will, slink into the shadows of the United States, and had actually gotten bold enough in many situations to begin to come out of the shadows and expose itself to the light of American constitutional republicanism. It was actually using the very fabric and foundation of what was made the United States the great nation that it is and became and was and always will be, if we can hold on to our constitutional republic. It was using that very fabric and that very foundation to advance its own agenda. The vast majority of the labor unions at the time, while sorely needed in many industries like meat packing and in factories and other places, the mass movement to unionize all industry, all occupational work, is traceable to the work of Marxists, communists in the United States. They saw a need in their eyes to infiltrate labor and organize it as a tool against capitalism, a tool against entrepreneurship, a tool against the wealthy, and they were successful. They unionized massive amounts of labor, auto manufacturing, meat packing, pretty much any kind of production work. And there again, there were things about unions that were good. There were very few protections in place for employees, especially in meatpacking. If you read a lot of the books back in the day, they tell horror stories of people being maimed, killed in the line of work, and there being no recourse for family members, no recourse for the victims who survived horrible industrial accidents. Consider the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. The working conditions in that situation were absolutely atrocious. And the women who died because there were no protections in place. And by and large, frankly, much as we see today, the wealthy, the elite wealthy who controlled those kind of factories were able to buy off city officials and other officials or pay for protection from being held accountable. And their workers had no recourse. So there again, the idea that the unions were exclusively evil and served no good is fallacious. But were they rooted in only helping the people, or were they rooted in the Marxist ideology that we have to tear down, not lift up, but tear down uh, the wealthy and the the strong and allegedly privileged people in the United States. And my argument would be that their desire was to tear them down. See, what Marxism does, Marxism doesn't seek to lift people up out of the muck and the mire. It seeks to bring everybody down into the muck and the mire, which is one of the reasons why I tell people that you cannot fundamentally be a leftist progressive Marxist and a Christian at all. They're totally incompatible. You will never see them be able to mesh. You'll never be able to see them be able to merge. It's impossible for that to happen, because what Christian ideology, Christian theology, doctrinal stances teach is that the gospel comes into the life of a non-believer, and it lifts them up out of the muck and the mire of their, if you want to use the term, brokenness, of their sinfulness, and it elevates them up, so that even if they're not financially as well off as the Christian next to them, they're viewed as God, or excuse me, not viewed as God. They're viewed by God as being the same, because they have been purchased through the shed blood of Christ. What Marxism does is it says we have to tear everybody down. Christianity lifts everybody up. Everybody. Because it sees an intrinsic value in all human life. Rich, poor, black, white, Asian, Hispanic. There's intrinsic value in all human life. Marxism says your value is only predicated on what you can provide society. Is that accurate? No. And Marxism also says that if you're wealthy, you're stealing from someone who could be better off if you weren't as well off. And the only way to make that happen is to break down the production means and the people who provide for the production means in the United States, to take them down to the same level of the people that they employed. And that was the whole purpose of unionization in the United States in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, which is why, sadly, many on the right, Republicans and others, fought against unionization, because they saw the stranglehold that communist Marxists had on the union work. So with the inception of the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1938, the United States Senate and the House began their long, slow trudge to fight off Marxism. There again, as I said before, they got a lot of stuff wrong. McCarthy stepped into that morass and really brought the light of I don't want to say righteousness, but really brought a powerful light of freedom and liberty. He shone the light of liberty and freedom onto a people who wanted to enslave. And so his hearings, the drive, was a positive thing. And what McCarthy was looking at was the precedents and the trend that was happening throughout the entire modern world at that time, which was to take over entire regions. Look at the reference to the Soviet era, the Soviet bloc. The USSR didn't technically have an empire where they controlled specifically from Moscow and all these little satellite countries, but they absorbed them into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they left puppet governments in place. And those places that didn't fall specifically to the power of the Soviet Union were still puppet governments. They were communist dictatorships, and they were destitute. And that's what McCarthy was terrified of having happen in the United States. And so there again, as I've said before, while he may have established some precedents that are now being used against constitutionally minded patriotic Americans, he was right to fight against Marxism. Now, if you're an American citizen, do you have a right to be a Marxist? According to the Constitution, you do. If you're an American citizen, you have a right to be an anarchist. You have a right to be a statist if you want. I hate statism. You have a right to be a nationalist. I don't think there's anything wrong with having national pride. I really don't. I think all Americans, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their country of origin, should take pride in being Americans. But you're not obligated constitutionally to be proud of America. You're not obligated constitutionally to be a Republican. You're not obligated constitutionally to be a Democrat. You can be a socialist. You can be a libertarian. You can be whatever you choose to be, as long as you're not a threat to the United States. And what McCarthy saw is what so many of us see today, is that Marxism is a threat, a fundamental threat to the fabric of the United States. It should be fought against. It should be battled against, but it shouldn't be a violent battle. It should not be a battle of running door-to-door fights here in the United States. It should be a battle of ideas, because Marxism cannot stand the light of intellect and reasoning. It's impossible for Marxism to stand against that, because Marxism says oppress everyone. And it says oppress everyone by saying that everyone is oppressed except for whatever group of people is allegedly in power in a particular country or in a region at any given time. And so here, right now, let's look at where we are in the United States. In the United States, we're being told that the group of people who has all the power are, as the phrase is used, cisgendered white men. The white patriarchy is the problem. They are the oppressors in the United States. And our Marxist movements have come into that and have used the tactics of not just Karl Marx, but of Gramscian socialism, Gramscian theory, Gramscian Marxism, and has started this culture war where everything has to be about how, if you're a white heterosexual male, you are constantly oppressing someone, just by the very nature of who you are and what you do. And that's what McCarthy was fighting against. McCarthy wasn't looking to shut down people who were minorities. McCarthy wasn't looking to shut down people who weren't male. He wasn't looking to shut down people who weren't Republicans. He was looking to stop the spread and the threat of Marxism in the United States, because their stated goal was to take over every nation they could. You have to understand that. If you do nothing else, if you hear this video or you watch this video and you hear what I'm saying and you think that I'm a radical for saying it, Marxism's stated goal is here in the United States is the eradication of the very fabric of what makes the United States the greatest nation on the earth. There are groups here in this nation today, right now, who are proud of their Marxist affiliations. They are proud of who and what they are. The founders of the Black Lives Matter organization are trained Marxists. They are proud of it. Now, they've removed much of that bragging from their website because they got caught. They got found out. But it's out there for you to find. It hasn't been completely memory holed yet. There are places where you can go and find the information where they've stated their goal is the eradication of the traditional American family, not just white, the traditional American family. They want family to go away. They want the American form of government to go away. They want the destruction of capitalism. They want the inception of Marxist ideology across the entire spectrum of the United States. But they're not the only ones. Groups like the Black Panthers, the new Black Panthers, the new Black Liberation Army, these are all resurfacing Antifa the anti-fascist movement in the United States, while it may not be one core cadre of people running things from one centralized location, anti-fascists are by their nature Marxist. And they label everyone who's not anti-fascist in their mentality a fascist. But by their nature, they're authoritarians. They want the power. They want to control, which is why they use the tactics that they're using now, which they learned from McCarthy back in the 50s. So these groups, their inception started in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and we fought them off for a while. And McCarthy did a good bit of that fighting. But when he lost the fight, when he lost the power that he had in the Senate, that emboldened the Marxists at that time. And we saw that. Look, you can say what you want, but the vast majority of people who were involved in the, oh boy, I want to be very careful how I say this. The vast majority of the organizations involved in the civil rights movement, as they won victories, had links directly to Marxist ideology and Marxist nations. There is a phenomenal book written by a man with the last name Burroughs. It's called The Days of Rage. Now, the Days of Rage is a very specific incident that took place, if you've ever heard of the Chicago 7. But the Days of Rage is a reference to that. But the entire point of this book, The Days of Rage, is to link the radical groups at that time to their Marxist underpinnings, to their Marxist roots. Their Marxist roots came from the collapse of the McCarthy hearings and the collapse of the House Un-American Activities Committee. When those two things in particular were taken away from their public use, the Marxists were emboldened, and there was no defending against them at that point. Now, there again, they have a right to believe what they want to believe, and they even have a right to espouse those beliefs. But they did a massive amount of damage. And we saw the work that they did in groups like the Weather Underground or the Weathermen. Now, some of you are like, oh, the Weather Underground, isn't that like a app on my phone that I can check weather all around the country? Yes, but the Weather Underground, the Weathermen, were a radical Marxist group in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s who perpetrated bombings. And you probably aren't familiar with that. There were massive leftist Marxist bombings from the 60s into the 70s and into the 80s. You only think of terrorism in the United States as being a product of white supremacists or white power or white nationalist or radical lone wolf Islamist. And that's not the case. The vast majority of terrorism that's happened in the United States, taking out the number of people killed, obviously September 11th, 2001 wins that award. But the vast majority of bombings, terrorist bombings and terrorist activities and bank robberies that have been perpetrated by groups have been perpetrated by Marxists in this country. Undeniably. Foundationally true. And once again, check out the book, The Days of Rage. It's a factual telling of the Marxist revolution attempt here in the United States. That's what McCarthy was fighting against. That's what McCarthy was protecting us from, and he was right. He was right. So let's talk about one of those Marxists. Are you familiar with Bill Ayers, NPR host? Yes, Bill Ayers was a member of a Marxist terrorist organization that was hell-bent on bombing government buildings. And they did. They and people affiliated with them bombed prisons, bombed government offices, bombed the Pentagon. But you don't know that, do you? Because you're not taught about it. That's why McCarthy was right. That's what he got right. How about the Puerto Rican fronts that were vying for Puerto Rican independence. Now we've got people vying for Puerto Rican statehood. Back then it was Puerto Rican independence. And they were bombing places all over the East Coast. The Black Panthers were predominantly, without apology, without any excuse, would flat out tell you they were Marxist. And some of their people fled to Marxist nations, some to Cuba, some to places in Africa for training. Some of them came back with that training. Some of them stayed in exile in Marxist countries. Cuba praised the revolutionary tactics of the people on the left during the Marxist uprisings in the late 60s, in the 70s and 80s. Cuba praised them. Look, they identified with men like Che Guevara. Now look, Che Guevara is not a hero. Che Guevara was a mass murderer. He was a Marxist murderer. And he targeted people all over the place and taught people tactics that were meant to instill absolute terror and fear in people. That's what Joseph McCarthy was battling. So while he damaged a lot of people's lives, he hurt people who didn't deserve to be hurt, he was still right overall. But here's the deal. The fear and the hurt that McCarthy caused is nothing compared to what the terrorist organizations like the Weather Underground and the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, remember Patty Hearst? Marxist organization. The SLA was Marxist, okay? The Black Panthers were Marxist. The Black Liberation Army was Marxist. Weather Underground or Weathermen, Marxist. The FLNA, I think I'm FNLA or FLNA, either one of them, however you say it, they were Marxist. And they weren't the only ones. They had splinter groups, they had subgroups, they had offshoots all over the place. They were killing cops, they were killing National Guard members, they were killing bankers, they were attempting to kill entrepreneurs, attempting to kill corporate executives. They raided banks and said that they were doing it to challenge the bourgeoisie. So you hear people using that term today. Oh, you're so bougie. Look, that's Marxist language. It's Marxist language directed at making people who seem to have a little bit or might maybe be comfortable. Oh, you're bougie. That's divisive language. And that's what McCarthy was battling. McCarthy and his allies were battling it. Yes, they screwed up on how they fought sometimes, but they got a lot right. And they should have been allowed to continue to explore the influence of Marxism, because Marxism has taken over the vast majority of colleges today. Critical race theory is a brainchild of Marxist ideology. Critical sexual theory is the brainchild of Marxist ideology. Critical gender theory is the brainchild of Marxist ideology. The new waves of feminism are not about feminine equality, about women having the right to vote, women having the right to have an equal amount of pay for an equal amount of work. The new feminist movements are firmly rooted in and supported by Marxist ideology. Now, could you say this is all my opinion? Absolutely, and I wouldn't disagree with you. This is all opinion-based. These are my thoughts and my beliefs. But I can point to, I can trace to, in an open dialogue, if you wish, I can take you to where all of this is demonstrably true. And as I pointed out before, Saul Alinsky, Antonio Gramsci, John Dewey, and other people are fundamentally behind what we're seeing happen in the United States today. Rahm Emanuel was a disciple. The former mayor of Chicago was a disciple of Saul Alinsky. It's Rahm Emanuel who, taking Saul Alinsky's teachings, coined the phrase, never let a crisis go to waste. What have we seen now in the last week here in the United States? We have seen leftist-minded politicians seizing on the mass shooting in Atlanta, in the Atlanta, Georgia area last week, and then this week, the mass shooting in Boulder, Colorado, seizing on it, using that mentality of, or that theory of, or that practice of never letting a good crisis go to waste, and now demanding immediate action on gun control. That's from Marxist ideology. That's what it is. And Marxist ideology has been driving the fight to get guns out of the hands of regular people. See, what they're interested in is not giving everybody an equal opportunity to have a positive outcome. They're interested in giving everybody the equal amount of misery. And that's what men like McCarthy and Richard Nixon, for all their faults, were fighting against. They saw that Marxism was going to erode the very fabric of the United States. And that's where we are now. Did you ever think you would see the day when federal buildings, the federal Capitol, would have armed troops protecting it, when there's no threat anymore? Now, what happened on January 6th was wrong, and it shouldn't have happened. But now we have people in the Democrat Party demanding that armed troops always be in place, demanding that the fences not come down. While they're making plans to take the fences down, there are people demanding that they not come down. There are people in state capitals demanding that their capitals be closed forever to the general public and be constantly protected from the people. Wanting to keep the riffraff out, as if the American people are prone to, just on a whim, storming Capitol buildings and killing all their legislators. We should not do that, by the way. But why? Because Marxism has to rule by fear. And the only way that you can rule by fear is by making sure that the people who are afraid of you have no means to defend themselves, have no means to protect themselves. And that's what they're gunning for. Excuse the terminology. Sure, Joseph McCarthy and his allies did some things that we should not be proud of, but they were right. Marxism is the single greatest existential threat to the American way of life that has ever come and threatened us. And unlike any other threat, unlike the Soviet threat, unlike the Nazi threat, unlike the fascist Japanese threat of World War II, the threat of a powerful and allegedly peaceful Marxist takeover of the United States is far more real and valid today than anyone could imagine. We have members of the House of Representatives. We have members of the Senate at both the federal level and at state levels, proudly espousing their Marxist ideologies, proudly, and demanding that action be taken to execute their ideological positions. Ilhan Omar has proudly proclaimed Marxist ideologies and the destruction of, and called for the destruction of American capitalism. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has proudly called for Marxist ideologies to be implemented. We can't sit back and let that continue. We have to fight it, but we have to fight it the right way. And we have to fight it with truth. And we have to fight it with running candidates who are going to fight against and root out the evil of Marxism in this country and work through the political system to finally silence the cry for Marxist rule in the United States, even if a lot of the people crying for it don't realize that that's what they're crying for. Every single time you put your hand out to the government and say, I need your help, I can't do this on my own, and it's not fair that somebody else has more money than I do, you're crying out for a Marxist solution to a problem that only you should be having to fix. The vast majority of the people of this country have no idea how dependent they are on Marxist thought. And they're gladly embracing, as I said, the existential threat of Marxist ideology, as long as they can be taken care of and protected from cradle to grave, which is an absolute aberration when you read the Constitution and what it stands for. So once again, McCarthy got some things wrong and he handled some things very poorly, but overall, he was 100% right to be concerned about the threat of communism, the threat of Marxists in the United States. And once they shut down the House Un-American Activities Committee, once they were able to silence Joseph McCarthy and his allies, well, they won a major fight. And it's time for us to stand up and take our country back from that mentality. I don't want to be taken care of from cradle to grave. I want you to get out of my life and leave me alone. That's what being a traditional, constitutional, patriotic American means. Let me do my own rugged, individualistic thing so that I can excel, so that I can pursue happiness, so that I can exercise my liberties, so that I can exercise my pursuit of joy in being an American. Don't tread on me. And all Marxism wants to do is walk all over you and strip from you everything the Constitution guarantees is yours. So, sorry, revisionist history types. Joe McCarthy, for all his faults, was a hero, and he got most of it right. Should we implement his tactics today? Nope, because as we can see, they're using them against us. But it's time we start running people for office who are willing to stand up and call out Marxism where they see it. And I don't care if it's the local school board or the dog catcher. We need to silence Marxism in the United States today. But we need to do it by voting them out of office and running true, patriotic, constitutionally minded Americans for those positions. So, as much as you may not like it, thank you, Joseph McCarthy, for at least trying, while the rest of us today, for the most part, are sitting back, crying about everything that we don't like. Until next time, sic, semper, Marxist tyranny.